New draft of COP26 agreement includes weakened, but unprecedented language on fossil fuels. While it shows a good deal of political progress, it essentially defers more action on emissions to COP27, which will be in Egypt. That means it doesn't quite reflect the urgency expressed by international scientists in their key, Code Red for Humanity, climate report published over the summer. The draft comes after 12 days of wrangling, the last day of the nearly 2-week climate conference, but is not final. All 197 parties in attendance will need to agree on each and every word of the final agreement. The lasting divisions still center around who exactly should pay for the impacts of the climate crisis, and further watering down is entirely possible. Here's what's in the draft. Fossil fuels get a mention. The fact that any mention of fossil fuels survived the editing cull is a win for the COP26 presidency, particularly in its current form, which calls for the phasing out of unabated coal and an end to fossil fuel subsidies. If the language makes it into the final text, it will be the first time a conference of the parties' climate agreement makes any mention of the role of coal, oil and gas, the biggest contributors to the human-made climate crisis.
However, the new version of the paragraph is weaker than the initial draft published on Wednesday, indicating just how tough the fight over its inclusion was. The new text calls for the acceleration of the phase-out of unabated coal power and of inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. The added word unabated essentially means countries could continue to use coal if they are able to capture large amounts of the carbon dioxide they emit. The concept is controversial as the technology to fully capture greenhouse gases is still in development. And inefficient was also added, leaving that part of the agreement fairly open to interpretation. It's always a bit of a trade-off. The fact that we've got the phase-out of fossil fuel subsidies and the phase-out of coal in the text is really new and important. Helen Mountford, Vice President of Climate and Economics at the World Resources Institute, said in a briefing. The fact that they've added an unabated in front of coal and inefficient in front of fossil fuel subsidies, compared to the text a couple of days ago, is definitely going back to some more comfortable negotiated language in other fora. So I would expect that some countries like Saudi Arabia would have been pushing for adding the inefficient in front of the fossil fuel subsidies. Chris Littlecote, Associate Director at E3G, said the addition of the word unabated doesn't necessarily create a new loophole. He said it reflects the current thinking on emissions. Bolder emissions deadline is retained, but some watering down to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees, as agreed under the 2015 Paris Agreement. Every country needs to have a plan that aligns with that goal. Under Paris, all signatories were required to submit new, more ambitious plans this year. But while there have been some improvements, a key analysis by Climate Action Tracker published this week showed the world is on track for 2.4 degrees of warming. That would mean the risks of extreme droughts, wildfires, floods, catastrophic sea level rise and food shortages would increase dramatically, scientists say. The draft agreement requests that countries go back to the drawing board and come back with stronger plans by the end of next year. That is a positive development, because it gives a precise deadline on when these should be delivered. Under Paris, countries were only required to do this by 2025. However, this new draft gives countries some wiggle room by adding that different national circumstances would be taken into account. That comes after a group of developing countries suggest they should not be held to the same standards as wealthy nations, which historically have a much greater role in the climate crisis than developing ones. The Friday draft agreement, published by the 26 Colombian Pesos presidency, also retains language saying the world should be aiming to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The document recognizes that the impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees Celsius and resolves to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To do that, rapid, deep and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions are required, the document says. That language is in line with the latest science, which shows the world must limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels in order to avoid the climate crisis worsening and approaching a catastrophic scenario. While it's progress on the political level, the agreement is far weaker than what scientists say is necessary for the world to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The most recent UN climate science report showed that the world needs to nearly halve emissions over this decade to keep that limit within reach. A doubling on funding for developing nations to adapt to the crisis. Rich countries agreed more than 10 years ago to transfer $100 billion a year to developing nations to help their transformation to low-carbon economies and to adapt to the climate crisis. Adaptation can involve anything from building seawalls to prevent flooding, to moving communities back from the coast and retrofitting homes to better withstand extreme weather events. At the moment, the draft agreement says $40 billion should go to adaptation, so the gap is narrowing. Overall, I do think what we're seeing here is the text is more balanced in favor of some of the issues that the vulnerable countries and the developing countries have been pushing for. Helen Mountford, Vice President of Climate and Economics at the World Resources Institute, said in a briefing. It also mentions for the first time a new system to pay for loss and damage, which essentially involves wealthy countries being held financially liable for the impacts of the climate crisis. The US and EU are opposed to that measure. And while the first draft noted with serious concern that money provided to developing countries to deal with the climate crisis was insufficient, the latest draft only omits the word serious. What does it all mean? While there's plenty of progress here, the devil is in the detail, and the draft agreement waters down several key sections. That is fairly common in the negotiation process. The new language on fossil fuels creates loopholes for coal, oil, and gas-producing nations to continue with business as usual, as long as they use technology to capture the carbon dioxide emitted, or possibly even offset emissions. Adding the consideration for country circumstances could create another loophole.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.